Chapter 10. Pre-Wedding Festivities. The children grew up. The time came to search for soulmates. Festivities were a great help to young people in this important undertaking. Young Vedras people would gather in the evenings at a designated place, usually just outside the settlement. They would light a bonfire, chat among themselves, or sing songs. And once a week there would be a common festivity involving 3 or 4 settlements, all told at one of their favorite spots, where they would similarly light a bonfire, sing songs, and chat among themselves. But there were some festivities which were especially useful in helping young people find their soulmates. While such festivities were outwardly quite simple, their simplicity harbored a great inner significance. Ruchayuk. There was a game called Ruchayuk, for example. Young people lined up in pairs. One couple after the other took each other's hands and raised them high, forming an arch overhead. To start with, boys were paired with boys, girls with girls. The first pair, or anyone left without a partner, would go to the end of the stream and bend over, pass under the arc of raised arms to the head of the line. Those passing through the stream were not supposed to look up. They were supposed to slap somebody's arm at random, thereby selecting him or her as a temporary partner. Whoever was selected followed suit, and the 2 of them then stood at the head of the line of couples. Those left without a partner went to the end of the line and chose a new partner in a similar fashion. The game was simple, but think about it, Vladimir. Upon clasping hands for the first time, the young people could convey a great many feelings for each other without words. Recognition, gratitude, and love, or, on the other hand, revulsion. As the game went on, the couples switched, and it was easy to compare which pair of hands held the most pleasant feelings for you. Chatuska Govarushka. This ancient wedding game was the most complex of its kind. Modern chatushka, which people still sing today, are derived from it. The game, known as Chatuska Govarushka, can be described as follows. 2 rows of people stood facing each other. One row was made up of young men, the other of young maidens. The last girl in the row dedicated a 4-line chatuska to the last chap in the men's row standing opposite her. Her singing would be accompanied by dance movements. Directly she finished, the rest of the girls quickly stamped their feet twice and clapped their hands 3 times. And if the lad standing opposite her did not succeed in composing or recalling from memory a worthy response, the girls started singing a new chatushka to the next young man in line. If the lad managed to come up with a worthy answer in the time allotted, the conversation would continue between them in the use of poetic witticisms. But that did not happen very often. In spite of the fact that young Vedras people knew a great many verses, still not everyone was able to think up of a worthy reply in the brief time available, especially since their rivals were trying their hardest to distract them from the sidelines by all their stamping and clapping. At one of these get-togethers of young people from different settlements, Lubomila was present. Radomir's 5 friends who had caught a glimpse of this extraordinary girl at the fair kept stealing glances at her. His closest friend, Arga, could not take his eyes off her at all. When the Ruchayuk game began, the usually bold and decisive Radomir walked under the couple's raised arms with the full intention of taking Lubomir's hand and making her his partner. But all of a sudden he got cold feet. He could feel her as he passed between the 2 rows. He would have felt her even if his eyes had been closed, but as he approached the spot in the stream where she was standing opposite her girlfriend, he slowed down ever so slow and found himself moving as in a dream. He ended up choosing a lad from a neighboring settlement. His friend Arga, however, turned out to have more self-confidence. When it came to his turn to pass through the stream, Arga picked Lubomila right away, grabbed her hand, and took up a position with her at the head of the line of couples, much to the envy of all the other young men. Afterward they questioned him. "What was it like when she held your hand? Did she squeeze it tight or not?" "I don't know," Arga replied. "I cannot remember aught. It just seemed as though my hand caught on fire. Touch and see for yourselves. It still feels hot." What a gal! the fine young lads exclaimed in amazement on the spot. "She's so hot with passion, it's as though she's burning with a flame from some mysterious fire." Radomir, in turn, heard all of this without saying a word. His own internal yearnings had been burning for some time. Ever since that day he first discerned this wondrous girl at the fair. He had been thinking about her day after day, first thing upon waking in the morning. She even appeared to him in his dreams. But even there it seemed he could not bring himself to touch her. Always successful in any undertaking, Radomir had a reputation as a poet. But now all of a sudden, even the simplest of words to describe her utterly failed him. When the Chatushka-Govrushka game got going, he stood in the middle of the row of young men next to his friend Arga. Lubomila was almost at the end of the maidens' row. When it came her turn to sing and dance the Chatushki, she began her song with ease. At once it was clear to all there that here was an extraordinary maiden indeed, impossible to beat. She switched themes in a flash. She sang couples no one had ever heard before. One after the other she won out over all the young men, even though she herself was the youngest of all. When it came to Arga's turn, he was still able to give a response to the crafty maiden, albeit not without a bit of a glitch. He replied to Lubomila with a quatrain, but she, without even waiting for the stamping and clapping, suddenly changed topic and offered up such a smooth new witticism in verse that Arga was completely thrown off the track and didn't even attempt to counter with one of his own. Next, it was Radomir's turn. Lubomila began singing to him, jauntily dancing to the rhythm of her verse. "Bold and eloquent you are, much you know, oh yes. Do you recall how in the lake you once washed my dress?" Some listeners laughed, thinking Lubomila was making a joke with her couplet. Some, including Radomir himself, could not figure out what it was all about. And not being able to figure it out, he found it impossible to offer any kind of answer. So Radomir could give no response to Lubomila. When the stamping and clapping came to an end, signifying the deadline for reply was up, he realized that his time had irretrievably gone by. This was something he could not allow. As though completely forgetting himself, he now began moving toward Lubomila, first one step, then a second, then a third. By this time he had come right up close beside her. Everybody fell silent, wondering why the rules of the game had been defied. Radomir stood silently before Lubomila, and all at once, against this background of silence, everyone standing in the rows heard Radomir utter, with audible aspiration, the Vedra's declaration of love. "With you, my marvelous goddess, I could co-create a space of love to last forever." Everybody waited with bated breath to hear what response this fiery-tongued maiden would come up with, but all of a sudden she became very meek. At first she deferentially lowered the gaze of her fiery eyes, but then raised them again. Tears began rolling down her cheek, and she whispered, "I am ready to help you in your grand co-creation." Finally, Radomir recognized in the maiden standing before him the same little girl whose dress he had washed in the lake so many years ago. He recognized her and took her by the hand. As they walked along side by side, they no longer had eyes for anyone else. The two rows of young people stood facing each other in silence as they watched the couple's love head into eternity. Chapter 11. The Wedding Rite. The Vedra's wedding rite, Vladimir, is something you already know about. You wrote about it in the Book of Kin. Let me remind you of the essence of these great acts. It was the lovers' task to jointly choose a place for their future domain. They would usually go out beyond the perimeter of the settlement where he lived with his parents, and then inspect the area around the settlement where she lived. And there was no need for the lovers to let their parents know of their intentions, as everyone in the settlement had an awareness and comprehension of the deed that this was leading to. On their chosen plot of land, measuring a hectare or more, the lovers drew up plans for their real life together. Their task was to mentally envision a house and arrange a whole lot of plants so that every part worked together with each other in harmonious precision. Lubomila and Radomir quickly found a spot for their future domain. As though by mutual agreement, they had each gone outside the boundaries of the settlement to a spot where there was a small grove of trees and a stream flowing by almost unnoticed from a small spring. Radomir had been here before. He had sat here alone, dreamt about the future, about his future life together with his beloved. Lubomila had twice come by her own on her faithful, fast-running horse without Radomir. She herself, without knowing why, had once halted her horse by the stream, walked over to the grove, let down her hair, put on a headband, and stood for a long time by a goodly young birch tree. Now the lovers stood in the spot together. "I was really pleased when I came here on my own," said Radomir. "I would like very much to continue our family line here." "And I like this place too," Lubomila whispered. Early the next morning, as soon as the dawn broke, Radomir brought to the place they had selected more than a dozen rods in a cart and long willow shoots, along with some small posts and a scythe. No sooner had he begun to cut the grass than he saw Lubomila approaching on her steed at a gallop. Radomir was absolutely delighted at the sight, and his heart started trembling. The beautiful girl leapt down from her horse before it had come to a full stop, 3 meters short of the as yet unmarked boundary line of their plot, and dashed over to Radomir. "I greet you with the dawning day, Creator," she said to Radomir, smiling. "The day has turned out to be a fine one, and I decided to bring along some colored ribbon to mark out the places for our future plantings." "Thank you for brightening the day," replied Radomir. The lovers did not kiss nor even embrace. According to Vedra's custom, anything like that was not seemingly to do before the wedding, and there was a considerable significance to be perceived in this. They did not make a daily routine out of kisses and embraces before their children were conceived, and therefore when the moment for conception arrived, their energies were at their peak potential, and they never set up dates for themselves. Each one would visit the selected spot on their own whenever they wished. Radomir was always the first to arrive. With each day's dawn, Lubomila would follow suit on her steed. Within a week, Radomir had constructed a shelter resembling a magical little house. It was 2.5 meters wide and 3 meters deep. He dug the rods into the ground, made the walls out of interwoven branches, and covered it with a combination of rods and branches. The lovers covered the whole thing with dried grass, and Lubomila spread the fabric cloth over the interior walls and ceiling, and she made 2 beds with straw on the bottom, hay on top, each bed covered with a cloth. When the magical little house was ready, the lovers would often rest and spend the night there, but they did not enter into intimate relations. Such intimacy before the wedding, before creating the nest, was considered an affront to their future children. Besides, the young people had a lot to keep them busy. Radomir brought a large board on which he carved the plan for their plot, indicating all the points of the compass, including the rising and setting of the sun, and the risings of the moon. Wind speed and direction for both daytime and nighttime were also recorded. Lubomila would often go to the perimeter of the plot, where she would stand for a long time, picturing in her mind their future plantings. She would also check with Radomir's plan to make sure they would not have any harm from the wind or shade. When winter came, Lubomila made less frequent visits to their love domain. She would spend her days weaving fabric in her parents' home and embroidering a shirt for Radomir with love. But Radomir came again and again to their future domain. He continued to obtain and note down information on wind movements and memorize how the snow lay in the plain. This is how the Vedras people over the years made a weather calendar. Every Vedras family had boards inscribed with such plans and were able to accurately describe the weather to come for a year in advance, 2 and 3 years ahead even. It might seem as though it would have been easier simply to copy a calendar like that from one their parents had made, but it would not have been entirely accurate. The landscape would be just a little bit different, and a copse or a hillock might be able to protect a plant from the wind. The wintertime snowdrifts, too, could be different. By the time spring arrived, the design was already complete in Radomir's and Lubomila's thought, and in early spring they began once more to live in their little house. The task now before them was to mark out all the planting areas with posts, ribbons, and branches, and harmonize their ideas with each other. Radomir had to dig a well and a fence off the water spring. There were only 2 weeks left until they could put the seedlings into the ground, and the lovers began preparing for the wedding. First, they went to the settlement where the groom lived, and then to the bride's. They would pay a visit to every house, inviting its residents to their wedding. In every house their arrival was eagerly anticipated. Everyone wanted to see their love and decide on a gift for their future living home. When the young couple visited a garden, a house, or a household courtyard, they would speak briefly to the residents. Just a sentence to each one. Something like, "Oh, what a splendid apple tree you have." "Your cat has a knowing look." Or, "Your bear is a real worker, very considerate." To any resident hearing the lovers praise a tree growing in the garden or the household cat, this was a sign of appreciation of the resident's worthy life. It also indicated that the young couple, too, would like to have a plant or an animal like that. The couple was not invited into the house nor given anything to eat. This was not just a random practice on the part of the Vedras people. It would not have been deemed considerate for the young lovers to refuse an invitation for a visit and a meal, but if they had started making extended visits, they would not have had enough time to go around to all the families before the wedding. Arga, who had known Radomir from childhood, broke the rules slightly. When the lovers paid a visit to his house and began talking with his father, Arga suddenly ran off and fetched a marvelous colt from the stable. The one that had earlier caught the fancy of the whole settlement. He started talking excitedly. "Please accept this steed as a present from me. Just as before, he has not let anyone near him since Lubomila made him submit that day at the fair." The father gave his son a sly smile and said, "Perhaps, Arga, you are not letting any horse breakers near your steed. For some reason you don't seem to want to break him in yourself." Arga replied, slightly embarrassed, "I haven't been breaking him in. I decided to leave this stallion forever free. But now I've changed my mind. Take this steed as a present from me," and he handed the reins to Lubomila. "Thank you," replied Lubomila, "but I cannot accept this steed, seeing as he is already accustomed to another. But if he has a colt, we shall gratefully accept it indeed." When the young couple had completed the round of the domains, and the wedding day that had been announced to all finally arrived, young and old began hastening at daybreak to the designated spot. People lined up along the perimeter of the plot of land which the young couple had staked out with dry branches. Right in the center, next to the shelter, a little mound rose out of the ground, decorated with flowers. Radomir mounted the hillock and excitedly outlined the plan for the future domain before the gathering. And each time the young man pointed to a spot where some sort of plant was to grow. Someone would step forth from the circle of listeners and go over to the place Radomir was indicating. And this man held in his hands a seedling of the plant Radomir had named. And each contributor who stepped forth was accorded a bow from the people in turn. After all, each contributor had earned the young couple's praise during the visits to the domain for having been able to grow a marvelous plant. This meant that he was worthy of the praise of the Creator, the Father of all, the all-loving God. After announcing their design, Radomir came down from the mound and went over to the spot where his Lubomila was following the whole procedure with excitement and trembling. He took her hand and led her solemnly to the little mound where the lovers now stood together before the whole gathering. Then Radomir once again addressed the crowd. "I was not alone in creating this space of love. Here beside me and standing before you people is my marvelous inspiration." The girl, or more properly, a maiden, initially lowered her gaze before the gathering. Every woman has her own beauty, but there can be moments in every woman's life when she shines above the rest. Such moments are absent in our modern culture, but back then... Now Lubomila raised her eyes to focus her gaze on the assembly. The excitement of the whole throng before her merged into a single exultation. The girl's face shone with a radiant smile, not of imprudence, but of courage. She was filled to overflowing with the energy of love. Her cheeks were aflush with a brighter than usual glow. The people and the whole space around them were captured by the warmth radiating from her luxuriantly healthy body and her sparkling eyes. For a moment, everybody froze in rapture. The young goddess stood before the people, shining in all her beauty. The people, in turn, could only admire the most delightful vision. This was why the maiden's parents waited before beginning their solemn procession, accompanied by the elderly and younger members of the whole family, to the mound where the loving couple was standing. Stopping at the mound, the family first bowed to the young couple, and now the mother asked the maiden, her daughter, "All the wisdom of the family lines lies in you, my daughter. Tell me, do you see the future of the land you have chosen?" "Yes, Mamma, I see it," replied Lubomila. "Tell me, daughter dear," the mother continued, "do you like everything about the future you have been shown?" "I really do like the design, but still I should like to add just a little something." Quickly jumping down from the mound, Lubomila all at once ran through the crowd to the edge of her future garden, where she stopped and said, "Here is where an evergreen should grow, with a birch beside it. When a breeze blows from that direction, it will first meet the branches of the pine, then the birch, and after that the breeze will ask the trees of the garden to sing a tune. It will not be repeated exactly the same way each time, but it will always be a delight to the soul. And here," the maiden added, running off a little bit to one side, "here flowers are to grow. First there will be a flush of red, then over here, a little later, violets will spring up, and burgundy over there." Lubomila, all aglow like a fairy, started dancing around her future garden, and once more the people remaining in the circle set themselves in motion, hurrying about to carry the seeds in their hands to the spots on the ground the high-spirited girl had pointed out. Upon finishing her dance, she once more ran up to the mound. Here, standing next to her chosen one, she said, "Now, the space here will be splendid in its sheen. The earth will produce a most marvelous scene. Tell, my daughter, for all to hear," her mother once more addressed her, "who will be crowned to reign over all this marvelous space around? All of the people living on the earth, upon whom could you bestow the crown?" Turning to her fiancé, the bride responded, "He is worthy to wear the crown whose thought is able to create a future that will be splendid all around." With these words, the girl touched the shoulder of the young man standing beside her. He got down on one knee before her. The girl solemnly placed on his head a most beautiful crown, a garland woven from nice, sweet-smelling grasses by the maiden's own hand. Then, running her fingers thrice through her fiancé's hair with her right hand, she took hold of his head with her left and drew it a little closer to herself. Then Radomir, now crowned, stood up while Lubomila ran down from the mound and bowed her head ever so slightly before him in a sign of meekness. Now, as was the custom, the young man's father, accompanied by his whole family, made its way over to the mound. As they approached, they stopped in respect, and the father asked his son, who was standing over the whole assembly, "Who are you whose thought is capable of creating a space of love?" And Radomir replied, "I am your son, and I am the son of the Creator. A crown has been placed upon your head, a sign of great mission to come. You who are wearing the crown, what will you do as you reign over your domain?" "I shall create a future that all around most splendid will remain." And the father asked again, "Where will you gain the strength and inspiration, my son?" and crowned son of the Creator? In love. Another question. The energy of love is capable of wandering through the whole universe. How will you manage to see the reflection of universal love on the earth? There is one girl, Father, and for me she is the reflection of universal love on the earth. With these words, the young man came down to where Lubomila was standing, took her by the hand, and led her back up to the mound, whereupon the two families merged into a single group, sharing hugs and jokes and laughter. Then the young man thanked everyone, and they all began to plant their living gifts in the spot Radomir had indicated earlier. Those not assigned a specific spot set about to walk around the perimeter of the plot which had already been marked out, and to the sound of the korovod threw the seeds they had brought with them into the ground. Within the space of a few minutes, a marvelous garden had been planted. Once again the young man wearing the crown held up his hand, and when all was quiet, said, "Let all the creatures given to man by the Creator live together with us in friendship." And those who had brought animals as gifts approached the shelter carrying a kitten or a puppy or a wee calf on a lead, or even a bear cub. Arga, Radomir's friend, gave them the colt he had promised. Then people quickly fashioned tree branches into a wicker fence to attach animal pens to the shelter. And soon the dwelling, which just a short time ago had been used by people as sleeping quarters, was now filled with animals who were similarly young. And there was tremendous significance in this, for in mixing with each other this way, these animals would forever live together in friendship, caring for and helping each other. After accepting the gifts, the young couple once again thanked everybody, and then a joyful celebration with songs and korovods began. The young people, however, withdrew with their families each to their own house. They would not see each other again until after 2 nights and 1 full day had passed. During this time, the best craftsmen of both settlements carried the pre-built framework of a log house to the new domain, put a roof on top, laid down the floor, and filled all the seams with moss and grass. And the women placed their best fruits of the harvest in the new home. The 2 mothers covered the bed with a linen counterpane, and by the 2nd night, every last one of the visitors was gone from the domain. The energy of love lingered over it in anticipation of the young lovers' coming. "Look what happens, Vladimir," said Anastasia, after finishing her account. "The Vedras family, in this case, little Lubomila's family, accepted the appearance of the feeling of love in the little girl as the gift of God, and they treated the appearance of this feeling as that of a new member of their family, sent by God as a helper in the raising of their little girl, perhaps as the primary helper. As a result, the girl's grandmother helped her understand what the great energy of love wanted of her, pointing to the concrete actions in a simple language comprehensible to a child. The little girl was inspired to start learning various disciplines, the pristine wisdom of being, and worked to perfect her own spirit and body." Who was primarily responsible, Vladimir, for Lubomila's success? Her grandmother, the wise men teachers, the girl herself, or the great inexhaustible energy of love? I would say that if you took away the energy of love, then all the other participants in the girl's upbringing would hardly be capable of getting even half of that done. But without them, the energy of love would have a hard time setting the girl on the right path all by itself. So then, what happened was a joint creation, and joy was shared by all from its contemplation. Well, that is precisely what God wants of man. I agree. The wedding rite itself is a festive masterpiece, altogether unsurpassed in beauty, significance, and rationality. If you compare it to modern wedding rites, it looks as though we've all transformed ourselves into a bunch of occult idiots. What are young people left with today after a modern wedding? Memories of gadding around in a car for some reason, to the eternal flame, a drunken spree in a cafe or restaurant, cries of Gorko, Gorko, and public kisses wasting energy that should be saved for the conception of a child. Whereas, after the Vedras wedding rite, the couple is left with not just the memories, but with the actual house built with joy by the finest craftsmen, a garden with a multitude of growing things planted by the hands of relatives as well as friends and neighbors who contributed to the young lovers' design. In reality, Vladimir, they are left with the actual space of love, a sacred, living, truly divine nest where the conception of a child may subsequently be expressed. The witnesses at a Vedras wedding rite comprise not just two friends, as it happens today, but all the relatives from the whole area, and they create designs not on pieces of paper, but in living creation on the earth. The young people in turn sit an examination together, describing their design for their future domain in front of the whole community. I would say their presentation is on an incomparably higher level than today's doctoral dissertations. Of course, the materialization of living space, the house, the homestead, the beauty of the actions used to create these, all play an undoubtedly important part. But there is one incredible aspect that is just as important. See who actually marries the young couple. Not the parents, not some random official in the civil registration office or a priest whom they often see for the first and last time. Lubomila herself places the crown on Radomir's head, in front of the whole gathering. This is an act that God's children are indeed entitled to fulfill. It is a psychological factor that is not as simple as may seem at first glance. A man who lets his love be registered by some random person is already relieving himself, on a subconscious level, of the responsibility for the subsequent fate of his family. Lubomila, by contrast, takes this responsibility upon herself. There are many formalities placed between modern couples registering their marriage and God. These include the blessings by parents, the registration at the civil office, and a priest in the church. By contrast, nobody stands between the Vedras couple and God. Consequently, their marriage can be blessed only by God himself. And even before the crowning, he really makes this into an actual manifestation. He sends them mutual love. The Vedras people knew how to accept it and make it eternal. And what happened, one might ask, before conception in the Vedras period? Chapter 12. Conception. The wedding rite had now taken place, but the young people did not simply hop into bed and engage in the wedding night activities we know about today, following a drunken spree. Their relatives did not make them lie in bed and then display the bloody sheet to the wedding guests the next morning, as has been done in many wedding rites, especially in the Caucasus. The young lovers went off, each to their respective parents' homes. They slept, and then made their ablutions. And in the execution of this whole custom there is a great significance. The excitement associated with the approval of the domain's design quickly passed. The excitement associated with the wedding itself, where their attention was totally occupied with each other in a climax, may have had a pleasurable dimension. But it was still accompanied by a degree of nervous tension. At their parents' homes, they rested and slept off the excitement, while of course still thinking about each other. 2 days later, they experienced their first encounter as husband and wife. And by this time, everything was ready for the conception of their child. It was not just a question of material benefits. The house, the warm enclosure for their animals, the vegetable garden, and the orchard were all very important, of course. But equally important was the mental and physical state of the young couple. Radomir woke before dawn, and without a word to anyone, he put on his garland and picked up his shirt that had been hand-embroidered by his mother. Then he headed off to the spring-fed stream. The moon illuminated his path through the pre-dawn darkness. While garlands of stars twinkled in the heavens, after washing the stream, he put on his shirt and quickly made his way to his sacred creation. The heavens began to brighten. and there he stood alone on the spot where the two villages recently celebrated their joy, the place he created through his dream. The power of the feelings and sensations within a man at such a moment can scarcely be comprehended by anyone who has not experienced them at least once for himself. It can be said that these sensations and feelings are divine in nature, and they have increased in quivering anticipation of the first ray of dawn, in which, there she is, his most marvelous Lubomila, illuminated in the dawn's rays. She ran to greet him and their co-creation. The vision incarnate ran to meet Radomir. While perfection, of course, knows no real limit, it seemed as though time had suddenly stopped for the two of them. Enveloped in the mist of their feelings, they entered their new home. The table was spread with delicacies, and a tempting fragrance of dried flowers wafted from the embroidered counterpane on the bed. "What are you thinking about right now?" she asked him in a heated whisper. "About him, our future child." And Radomir gave a quiver as he looked at Lubomila. "My, how beautiful you are." No longer able to contain himself, he very tenderly touched her shoulder and cheek. It was not just that Lubomila and Radomir felt a joy in their hearts. They kept looking at each other in silent delight. "My husband," Lubomila whispered to herself without making a sound. "My husband, I thank heaven and the whole universe. O righteous God, what happiness you give to people. The happiness of living a life in love." "My wife," Radomir thought as he looked at Lubomila. He closed his eyes and opened them again so as to see her all of a sudden afresh, as though she were the best vision in the world, as though the most important goddess in the world had appeared before him. But it was not just as though he saw the goddess Lubomila before him. Radomir saw a goddess in real life. The warm breath of love enveloped the twosome and carried them away to heights unknown. Nobody in a million years would ever be able to describe in detail what occurs between him and her, when people merge together into one for the purposes of co-creation and bringing forth the image of themselves and of God in a mutual impulse of love. But the God people of the Vedras culture knew for certain that when two people are joined together by an unexplainable miracle, each of them subsequently maintains his or her individuality. At the same time, the universe shudders at that unexplainable moment upon seeing the vision of the infant soul tripping barefoot through the stars, making its way to the earth, thereby embodying it in itself the twain, plus a third in one. The dawn progressed into a happy day, and the sun was rising over the earth. It shone more brightly with its delicate ray on the spot where the gods stood on the earth. And the energy of love, God's gift to the earthly gods, illuminated them with a light greater than the sun, invisible, radiating blessings, and the energy of love celebrated in joy. Is this energy intelligent? It is, like all feelings, particles of mind. It was considered by God to be the most important of all. When the grand creation of the earth was given birth by God, he told love, "Hasten, my love, hasten, do not stop for rational contemplation. Hasten with your spark, envelop them with your great energy of grace, all my future sons and daughters in your embrace." And now, when Lubomila and Radomir's conception took place in love, love called out to God, "You are invisible, great Creator, but your children are visible. I too was invisible. Now my reflection on the faces of your children I see. They are yours, and, in a way, mine to be. I want to nurse their children and understand how you, great Creator, were able to foresee when you gave to them, as a gift from you, the whole of me. And how you could likewise foresee earthly grace. Show yourself in all your beauty and grandeur, for all your children to see." God responded to love in a whisper of barely noticeable breeze. I myself would not presume to distract my children from their grand and inspired co-creation, and I beg you, my love, do not burn these young hearts in an impulse of your own delight. I remember how with the grace of your energy you once set me alight. I feel you are also burning our children with your delight. My God, I do not burn, I only warm them. When you said our children, I gave just a little shudder, and for a moment my energy in turn increased in me. But I restrained them. I declined to burn them. You distinctly said our children, which means they must also be, at least a little bit, mine. Those who are born in love will understand who their mother and father are. It might not be easy, Vladimir, to understand, but you must try. The intimate relations involved were by no means the lead factor in the Vedra's conception of children. What people do in bed today, calling it love-making, is a mere mockery of love and a debasement of God. The satisfaction of fleshly needs lasts but for a moment, and I would venture to say that it cannot compare with even 100th part of what has been determined in God's plan for man. The Vedra's people did not see each other as an object of fleshly desire. They saw something quite different altogether. When the desire came to Lyubomila and Radomir to create a child, they did not see him as being separate from themselves. The culture of feelings was quite different in those times. The husband and wife in their love saw in each other their own children, and consequently their caresses were quite different from today. People were not drawn to each other by the passion of copulation, but by the grand aspirations to co-creation. And Radomir embraced Lyubomila almost as his own child. He tenderly stroked her hair with his hand, touched her supple breasts, gently caressed her shoulders, and kissed the palms of her hands. Her hands touched his face and his shoulders. She tenderly clasped him by the neck and drew him to her breast as though comforting a child. There are many treatises in the world which try to teach the subject of intimate copulation, but there never has been and never will be a treatise capable of outlining the Vedra's approach to conception. The lovers' bodies were not the focus of attention. The bodies simply carried out people's will and desire. People at that moment found themselves living in a different dimension. When the great and worthy act was accomplished, they returned to the earth. The satisfaction they derived was no fleeting fancy. It remained with them eternally, as though lifting man one step higher in the direction of divine perfection. At the actual moment of conception, Radomir seemed to be in a state of oblivion, as though he had not yet returned from a dimension he had never known before. He kissed Lyubomila as though she were his own child, and fell asleep in a blissful dream. Men cannot help but fall asleep, perhaps because of an innate desire to return there once again. But Lyubomila did not sleep. She felt within herself, or so it seemed, an extraordinary particle of being. She rose from the bed and went over to the window where the sun was streaming through, dividing the window-sill into bright and shady sections. Lyubomila ran over to the line with her finger where the light and dark met. She took off the flaxen ribbon encircling her wrist and put it on the same line. The Vedra's people always marked the day and moment of conception. Then, on the spot where the wedding took place, they planted a tree whose trunk would be sure to grow straight. A second tree was planted at the moment when the border between light and dark coincided with the flaxen ribbon marking on the window-sill. The second tree was planted in the shadow of the first. This act allowed them to forever remember the moment at which they conceived the child. A horoscope calculated from this point will always be more accurate. The Vedra's people knew about the positioning of the planets and their influence on the flesh. Nevertheless, in spite of the planets, they were able to accomplish successful deeds, since it was a great energy that they possessed. Subsequently, they poured the birthing water there, and buried the placenta there in the earth, and when he got older, a man would go to sleep in the same spot on the anniversary of his conception. The position of the planets slightly varied from year to year, and a man could feel all the information coming from the cosmos on the night of such a sleep, not with his mind, but rather with his feelings, in his subconsciousness, right up to God's creation of everything earthly. And if there were any sorrow or disease, the dream could eliminate it on the spot with ease. But only very rarely could any disease of the flesh affect the Vedras people. The place of conception served them as a place to sleep and become consciously aware of the whole order of the universe. Chapter 13. Telogyny can be overcome. Anastasia, I heard that the wise men knew how to overcome the phenomenon of telogyny, the consequences of previous relationships. If a woman has a prior relationship, then the first man, as is now known, will undoubtedly exert an influence on the appearance and character of a child fathered by another man, the woman's husband, for example. If they go through the wedding rite you spoke of, does that mean that the consequences of the woman's previous relationship will be eliminated once and for all? Vladimir, the child does not always have to resemble the previous partner. When the new events in the woman's life and the sensations of her feelings are sufficiently bright, the information about prior unsuccessful relations will be erased. Still, the Vedras people had a rite which could help erase old, unwanted information. It purifies both the man and the woman, and 3 thoughts must participate. Whose thoughts those are, try to guess on your own. It would be better for you to tell me yourself, Anastasia. My brain is overtaxed, as it is from too much information. Fine, I shall tell you. But it is very important that people learn to draw the conclusions they need for themselves. At some point they will learn, but for right now you had better explain it, seeing as how the question is so important. Then give me a full formulation of a question as to what interests you. What do you mean a full formulation? Vladimir, you are aware, are you not, that this phenomenon touches not only women, but in equal measure men. A man's previous relationship can also exert an influence on his future children, and the most upright and chaste girl can bear a child which is not her own, if the man is not a virgin. You know about that, Vladimir? Yes, Anastasia, unfortunately I do. I read how one soldier on his way home from an army service had too much to drink at the railway terminal and slept with an Asian prostitute. He came back to his village and married a girl who had been waiting for him. They produced a child who had swarthy skin and slanting eyes. Everybody started blaming the girl, but there wasn't a single Asian anywhere in the vicinity. I thought, though, that it wasn't really that necessary to bring up the subject of men. It is vitally necessary to talk about men, too. They are to play the principal role in the rite. The rite consists in this. The man must set up their bed in the open air under the stars on the spot where the couple live in natural surroundings. He should prepare the bed for himself and the woman. They should fast for 3 days and sleep 3 nights under the stars. And before they go to sleep, each time the man should wash the woman and himself with spring water. The man should rub the woman down with flaxen fabric, but not rub himself down, just get the water droplets off himself with his hands. The man should still be wet when he lies down in the bed with the woman. During those 3 days they should not let themselves indulge in intimate relations. While they are falling asleep under the stars, on the first night they should forgive each other for all past transgressions, and right away, right from that very first night, visualize their future child. The man should think about how their child should be like the woman, and the woman about how the child should resemble the man. After these 3 days have gone by, they are free to engage in fleshly intimacy, while the planets will erase all the information they might be harboring about the past, about children that have never been conceived. But before entering into intimate relations, the man has an obligation to place a garland upon the woman's head. In the normal Vedra's wedding rite, this is done by the girl. She places the crown on the head of her chosen one. But in this variant, it is the man who is to crown the woman. This rite does not necessarily pertain to couples who have jointly sought out and found their own domain and have started to live in it. Why not? The search itself and the first 3 days of preparing the site will purify them if they spend 3 days thinking of their future child without actually conceiving it. Anastasia, what about the third thought? You did say 3 thoughts had to take part at the same time. Yes, I said that. And in the case we are looking at, there were 3 thoughts. By the third night, while the man and woman were sleeping under the stars, they were already receiving help from the thought of their future child. And where might he have been? Where all children await earthly embodiment before conception. So here, Vladimir, is the whole rite which a great wise man came up with and freely offered to people. He himself rejoiced at how effective the rite proved to be, and there was a subsequent increase in the number of happy families. Did you understand everything, Vladimir? And can you now try your hand at telling people about this rite? Of course, I understand, and I shall tell it all in time. And you will not add anything to this account of mine? No, I shan't. Then I can say that the rite will not be effective. In what way? Why not? There is no participation on the part of our ancestors' thought. Yes, I remember your grandfather saying that we need to apologize to them. I shall remind my readers of this, although it's still not entirely clear to me why it is up to our generation in particular to apologize. After all, we were not the ones responsible for hiding their culture from people's eyes or for its demise. Of course, one could think that we are not to blame, but it would be better if a different thought came to mind. A different thought? What kind? Upon our generation has fallen the great honor and grace of restoring the culture of our forebears, to bind up the torn threads that have remained linking us with them. Only then will great discoveries begin to take place among mankind. Only then will their thoughts be able to help ours. For now, their thoughts, in view of our lacking of understanding, feel constrained to withstand us.